The people who laugh first are usually the most shocked when the truth finally arrives. The ballroom shimmered beneath 1,000 strands of warm crystal light, each reflection dancing across polished marble floors like liquid gold. A string quartet played softly near the stage, their music floating above the low hum of conversation and clinking champagne glasses. Guests dressed in tailored suits and elegant evening gowns gathered in small circles, smiling for photos and exchanging congratulations. It looked like the perfect wedding. It looked like the kind of night people would remember forever. And for Claire Bennett, that was exactly the problem. The moment she stepped through the entrance, the room noticed her. Not because she made an announcement. Not because she demanded attention. She simply walked in alone. A few conversations slowed. A few smiles sharpened. Then came the whispers. Claire heard them before she even reached the reception hall. Some voices were soft. Others weren't trying to hide at all. That's her. Jason's ex-wife. I can't believe she actually came. This must be awkward. Claire kept walking. Her black evening dress was simple, elegant, and perfectly fitted. No flashy jewelry. No dramatic entrance. Just quiet confidence. Yet somehow that seemed to bother people more than if she had arrived looking angry. Across the ballroom, Jason Walker stood beside his fiancée, Tiffany Reed. He looked exactly like a man enjoying the best night of his life. His tuxedo fit perfectly. His smile seemed effortless. One hand rested comfortably at Tiffany's back as guests surrounded them with admiration. Then he saw Claire. For half a second, surprise flickered across his face. Then satisfaction replaced it. The kind of satisfaction that only appears when someone believes they have already won. Tiffany leaned toward him and whispered something. Both of them glanced in Claire's direction. Their smiles widened. Claire continued forward without changing her pace. The scent of fresh roses filled the air. Servers carrying silver trays moved between tables. Camera flashes sparkled across the room. Everything felt bright. Everything felt perfect. Yet, beneath the surface, there was tension. Invisible but undeniable. 5 years ago, Claire and Jason had stood in front of friends and family and promised forever. Tonight, only one of them remained part of that memory. As she approached the guest seating area, she noticed familiar faces. Former friends. Former neighbors. People who once filled her home during holidays. Some offered polite nods. Others looked away. A few stared openly, curiosity shining in their eyes. They were waiting for something. Maybe tears. Maybe regret. Maybe proof that Jason's decision years ago had been the right one. Claire gave them none of it. She calmly took her seat near the back of the ballroom and folded her hands in her lap. Her expression never changed. Around her, conversations continued. Laughter echoed. Glasses touched. Yet every few minutes, another pair of eyes drifted toward her. Watching. Judging. Wondering. What nobody noticed was the man seated several tables away. He sat alone near the edge of the room, dressed in a dark navy suit. No entourage. No introduction. No effort to attract attention. He seemed completely ordinary. Most guests never looked at him twice. But every now and then, his gaze moved toward Claire. Calm. Observant. Almost protective. Near the stage, Jason raised his champagne glass and welcomed everyone to the celebration. Applause filled the room. Tiffany beamed beside him. The crowd responded exactly as they were supposed to. Everyone seemed happy. Everyone seemed certain they understood the story unfolding before them. The successful groom. The beautiful new fiancée. The forgotten ex-wife sitting quietly in the back. It was a simple story. An easy story. The only problem was that it wasn't the truth. Jason's voice carried easily across the ballroom as he thanked everyone for coming. More applause followed. More smiles. More raised glasses. From a distance, it looked effortless. Like the story everyone expected to see. Claire remained seated near the back of the room, her hands resting quietly together while candlelight flickered across the table. A server passed by with a tray of sparkling water and champagne. She accepted a glass of water and thanked him with a small smile. Nothing about her suggested discomfort. Nothing about her suggested she wished she were somewhere else. Yet that calmness seemed to confuse people. Across the room, several guests continued stealing glances toward her. They remembered a different version of Claire. The woman who had once spent weekends helping Jason build his dreams. The woman who stayed late balancing budgets at their kitchen table while he chased opportunities. The woman who believed loyalty was something that lasted through difficult seasons. But memories are strange things. People often remember the ending more than the beginning. And Jason's version of the ending had become the popular one. 5 years earlier, he had walked away from their marriage with confidence. Back then, he was convinced he was making the smartest decision of his life. He had recently joined a fast-growing company. New connections filled his calendar. New opportunities appeared every month. The future looked bright. Claire, meanwhile, seemed ordinary. Predictable. Safe. At least that was how Jason described her to himself. One rainy October evening, he sat across from her at their dining room table and explained that they had grown apart. The words sounded polished. Practiced. Like a speech he had repeated many times before saying it aloud. Claire listened quietly. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Inside, the clock above the stove continued ticking. She never raised her voice. Never begged him to stay. She simply nodded once and asked if that was truly what he wanted. Jason said yes. The divorce was finalized months later. Most of their friends stayed connected to him. Some believed his explanation. Others simply followed the person who appeared more successful. Claire disappeared from their social circles almost overnight. Over time, people stopped asking about her. They assumed they already knew how her story ended. Back in the present, laughter erupted near the dance floor as Jason introduced Tiffany to another group of guests. Tiffany looked radiant beneath the ballroom lights. She accepted compliments easily, enjoying every moment of attention. Jason looked equally pleased. Several guests gathered around him, eager to hear stories about their future plans. Europe next summer. A larger house outside the city. Career promotions. New investments. Everything sounded impressive. Everything sounded carefully designed to communicate success. Claire listened from a distance without reacting. Then something unusual happened. A hotel manager appeared near the ballroom entrance. He checked his watch, adjusted his tie, and looked toward the doorway. Moments later, another staff member joined him. Then another. Their attention remained fixed on the entrance as if they were expecting someone important. A few guests noticed. Most did not. The man seated alone near the edge of the room noticed immediately. He glanced toward the entrance, then toward Claire. For the first time all evening, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the expression of someone who already knew something the rest of the room had not yet discovered. Meanwhile, the guests continued celebrating, completely unaware that the story they believed they were watching was already beginning to change. The string quartet transitioned into a slower melody as dinner service began. Crystal glasses reflected the glow of hanging chandeliers, and the scent of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and fresh herbs drifted across the ballroom. Guests settled into conversations about careers, vacations, and real estate. The wedding continued exactly as planned. Yet near the entrance, the unusual behavior of the hotel staff became harder to ignore. The general manager checked his phone twice within a minute. Two event coordinators quietly repositioned themselves near the front doors. Even the head of guest services appeared briefly before disappearing again. It was subtle enough that most people overlooked it. But not everyone. Claire noticed. So did the quiet man seated alone near the edge of the room. He glanced at his watch, then returned his attention to the stage where Jason was preparing another toast. Meanwhile, Jason was enjoying every second of the evening. Standing beneath soft golden lights, he wrapped an arm around Tiffany and smiled as guests applauded once again. Several people approached to congratulate them. Others asked about honeymoon plans. Jason answered each question confidently, speaking like someone completely certain about the future. Every compliment seemed to reinforce the story he wanted everyone to believe. Tiffany leaned closer and laughed at something he whispered. Nearby guests smiled warmly at the couple. From across the room, one woman quietly nodded toward Claire's table. "I wonder what she is thinking right now," she murmured. Her companion followed her gaze. Probably wishing things had turned out differently. Claire heard neither comment. Or perhaps she did and simply chose not to react. She lifted her glass and took a small sip of water. Calm. Composed. Untouched by the assumptions surrounding her. A few moments later, one of Jason's former coworkers approached Claire's table. His smile looked polite but cautious. "Claire," he said. "It has been years." "It has," she replied warmly. "You look well." He seemed surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "I heard you moved away after the divorce." Claire nodded. "For a while. And what are you doing these days?" The question hung in the air. Not rude. Yet not entirely innocent either. Before Claire could answer, another guest interrupted from a neighboring table. "Jason always had a gift for business. I imagine keeping up with him would be difficult for most people." Several nearby guests chuckled softly. The remark was delivered with a smile, but the meaning beneath it was obvious. Claire simply returned the smile. "Life takes people in different directions," she said. Her response was so calm that the conversation died almost immediately. The man who had asked the question looked embarrassed. Across the ballroom, Jason noticed the exchange. He watched for several seconds before turning away. Whatever reaction he had expected from Claire, he was not getting it. Then the front doors opened. No dramatic announcement followed. No music stopped. No spotlight shifted. Yet somehow the atmosphere changed. Several staff members immediately straightened their posture. The hotel manager walked forward personally. A black luxury sedan had just arrived outside the entrance, visible through the tall glass windows facing the valet area. Guests nearest the doors exchanged curious looks. Someone important had arrived. The question was simple. Who? At the edge of the room, the quiet man finally stood from his chair. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket and looked toward the entrance. For the first time all evening, there was no mistaking the respect in the eyes of the hotel staff. Whatever was about to happen, it was not part of the wedding schedule. And within a few minutes, every assumption inside that ballroom would begin to crack. The ballroom's conversation softened into a wave of curiosity as more guests began noticing the unusual attention focused on the entrance. Forks paused halfway to plates. Heads turned subtly. Even the musicians seemed aware that something unexpected was unfolding beyond the tall glass doors. Outside, the black sedan remained parked beneath the covered arrival lane. Rain from earlier in the afternoon had left the pavement shining beneath the hotel lights, creating reflections that shimmered like mirrors. The hotel manager stepped forward personally, accompanied by two senior staff members. It was a level of attention normally reserved for celebrities, major investors, or public figures. Yet nobody inside recognized the vehicle. Jason noticed it too. At first, he looked mildly interested. Then slightly annoyed. This was supposed to be his evening. Every spotlight belonged on him and Tiffany. Any distraction felt unwelcome. Beside him, Tiffany followed the movement near the entrance. "Do you know who that is?" she asked quietly. Jason shook his head. "Probably someone connected to the hotel." But his eyes remained fixed on the doors. Across the ballroom, Claire remained seated. Unlike everyone else, she showed no curiosity. No surprise. No anticipation. She simply glanced toward the entrance for a brief moment before returning her attention to the untouched centerpiece on her table. The soft candlelight reflected in her eyes. Calm. Controlled. As though she had already seen this moment coming. Then, almost unnoticed, a memory drifted through her mind. 5 years. Earlier, after the divorce papers had been signed, she had packed the final box from the home she once shared with Jason. The house felt strangely hollow that afternoon. Empty shelves lined the walls. Sunlight streamed through bare windows. Every room echoed with silence. Friends had expected her to fall apart. Some even waited for it. But grief had not arrived the way people imagined. Instead, it came quietly. In the mornings. In grocery stores. In parking lots. In ordinary moments where memories appeared without warning. During those first months, Claire rented a small apartment less than 700 square feet. The furniture was simple. The budget was tight. Every dollar mattered. She worked long hours, often starting before sunrise and finishing well after dark. There were no dramatic breakthroughs. No miracle opportunities. Just discipline. Consistency. And a determination she rarely spoke about. While others assumed her life had stalled, Claire was building something nobody could see. One client became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became dozens. Small projects turned into contracts. Contracts turned into partnerships. Slowly, year after year, the foundation grew stronger. She never posted about it online. Never sought attention. Never tried to prove anything to anyone. Especially not to Jason. Back in the present, the ballroom doors finally opened wider. A ripple of silence moved across the room. The hotel manager's posture straightened instantly. Several guests exchanged puzzled looks. Then the quiet man near the edge of the ballroom began walking toward the entrance. Every movement was measured. Confident. Familiar. And something unexpected happened. One of the guests near the front suddenly froze. His eyes widened. He leaned toward the person beside him. "Wait," he whispered. "That cannot be him." The person beside him followed his gaze. Seconds later, her expression changed too. For the first time all evening, uncertainty began spreading through the crowd. The story everyone believed they understood was becoming harder to explain. And standing quietly in the center of it all, Claire Bennett remained completely unfazed. The whisper spread faster. Then the music. One guest leaned toward another. A name was spoken quietly. Then repeated. Then repeated again. Within less than a minute, curiosity had transformed into disbelief. The man who had spent most of the evening sitting alone near the edge of the ballroom continued walking toward the entrance. His pace was unhurried. Confident. Familiar. Several guests stared openly now, trying to place where they had seen him before. One middle-aged executive standing near the front finally recognized him. The color seemed to drain from his face. "That is Alexander Hayes," he said under his breath. The woman beside him blinked. "Alexander Hayes? The Alexander Hayes." Her eyes widened instantly. Across the room, more people began hearing the name. Conversations faded. Phones appeared discreetly beneath tables. A few quick searches confirmed what some already suspected. Alexander Hayes was not merely successful. He was the founder of one of the fastest-growing investment groups in the country. Financial magazines featured him regularly. Business networks analyzed his acquisitions. His companies operated in multiple states and managed assets worth billions of dollars. Yet none of that explained why he was standing inside this ballroom. Jason noticed the change in the room almost immediately. The attention that had surrounded him all evening was shifting elsewhere. Guests who had been listening to his stories only moments earlier were suddenly distracted. Their focus drifted repeatedly toward Alexander. Jason frowned slightly. "Who is that?" he asked one of his friends. The friend hesitated. "You seriously do not know?" That answer alone was enough to make Jason uncomfortable. Near the entrance, Alexander stopped to greet the hotel manager with a simple handshake. There was no display of importance. No dramatic behavior. If anything, his calmness made the respect surrounding him even more noticeable. The staff treated him like someone whose presence mattered. Meanwhile, Claire remained exactly where she had been all evening. She did not stand. She did not wave. She did not attempt to draw attention to herself. Yet something strange began happening. As guests learned Alexander's identity, many of them started looking toward Claire. Back and forth. Alexander. Claire. Alexander. Claire. The connection was impossible to ignore. One woman quietly whispered, "Do they know each other?" Another guest nodded toward Claire's table. "They have looked in each other's direction all night." Jason heard fragments of these conversations. His expression tightened. Tiffany noticed it too. "Why is everyone staring at Claire?" she asked. Jason forced a laugh. Probably because she showed up alone. But even he no longer sounded convinced. At that moment, Alexander's eyes moved across the ballroom. They settled on Claire. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without hesitation, he changed direction and walked straight toward her table. Guests watched openly now. The string quartet continued playing, but hardly anyone was listening. Every step Alexander took seemed to increase the tension. Jason turned fully toward the scene. Tiffany followed his gaze. Several guests rose slightly from their chairs. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Claire finally looked up as Alexander approached. A warm smile appeared on her face. Not surprise. Not excitement. Recognition. Familiarity. The kind shared by people who knew each other well. When Alexander reached the table, he stopped beside her chair and spoke quietly. Whatever he said made Claire smile again. Then something even more surprising happened. Alexander pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. No introductions. No explanations. As though sitting next to Claire Bennett was the most natural decision in the world. And suddenly, for the first time all evening, people stopped wondering who Alexander Hayes was. They started wondering who Claire Bennett had become. The effect was immediate. The moment Alexander Hayes sat beside Claire, the balance of the entire room shifted. Conversations that had once revolved around wedding plans, promotions, and future investments now centered on a single question. How did Claire know him? Guests tried to appear casual while watching from a distance. Some pretended to focus on their meals. Others checked their phones while secretly glancing toward the back of the ballroom. But curiosity had already taken control. At the head table, Jason could no longer ignore what was happening. Every few seconds another guest turned toward Claire and Alexander. The attention he had enjoyed all evening was slipping away. Tiffany noticed it too. "Do they work together?" she asked quietly. Jason forced a shrug. "I have no idea." Yet the answer bothered him more than he wanted to admit. For years he believed he knew everything important about Claire. He believed he understood her limits, her ambitions, her future. Tonight, for the first time, he was being forced to consider the possibility that he knew almost nothing at all. Across the room, Alexander and Claire spoke comfortably, their conversation untouched by the tension surrounding them. There was no performance. No attempt to impress anyone. In many ways, that made the scene even more powerful. The people who truly mattered rarely felt the need to prove it. A few minutes later, another unexpected moment arrived. The hotel manager returned to their table carrying a leather folder. His posture was respectful. Professional. He handed the folder directly to Claire. Not Alexander. Claire. Several guests noticed immediately. The manager spoke quietly before offering a slight nod and stepping away. Claire opened the folder, reviewed a document, signed a page, and returned it without hesitation. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet it created another wave of whispers throughout the ballroom. One guest leaned toward another. "Did you see that?" The other nodded slowly. Why would the manager bring documents to her? No one had an answer. Meanwhile, a memory surfaced from years earlier. During the difficult months after her divorce, Claire often worked from a small coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment. Every morning she arrived before 7 o'clock. Every evening she stayed until closing. She built presentations. Reviewed contracts. Answered emails. Studied markets. While former friends assumed she was struggling, she was quietly building expertise. One decision at a time. One client at a time. One opportunity at a time. There had been no audience for those years. No applause. No recognition. Just persistence. The kind of persistence that eventually changes everything. Back in the ballroom, another guest finally gathered enough courage to approach Alexander's table. He introduced himself politely and congratulated Alexander on several recent business acquisitions. Alexander thanked him graciously. Then the guest turned toward Claire. "I did not realize you were connected." Claire smiled politely. "We have known each other for a while." It was a simple answer. Yet somehow it raised even more questions than it answered. Across the room, Jason watched every second of the exchange. The discomfort on his face was becoming harder to hide. The certainty he carried earlier that evening was fading. In its place was something unfamiliar. Doubt. Then another guest approached. And another. Within minutes, people who had barely acknowledged Claire's existence earlier were suddenly eager to speak with her. The shift was impossible to miss. The same room that had quietly judged her arrival was now searching for reasons to understand her importance. And standing near the ballroom entrance, one elderly investor finally recognized the name written on the leather folder the manager had carried. His eyes widened. He looked directly at Claire before whispering 3 words that would soon change everything. "She owns it." The 3 words moved through the ballroom like a sudden change in weather. "She owns it." At first, only a handful of people heard the comment. Then someone asked for clarification. Another guest joined the conversation. Within minutes, small groups throughout the room were quietly discussing the same possibility. The luxury hotel hosting the wedding was not merely a venue. It was one of the most prestigious properties in the region, known for hosting executives, celebrities, and high-profile events. Ownership of such a property represented a level of wealth most people could hardly imagine. Yet no one wanted to ask Claire directly. Instead, they watched. They listened. They searched for clues. Across the room, Jason felt the atmosphere changing around him. Earlier in the evening, every conversation seemed to reinforce his success. Now people were distracted. Questions about Claire were replacing questions about him. Even guests standing beside him occasionally glanced toward the back of the ballroom. Tiffany attempted to keep smiling, but uncertainty had begun creeping into her expression as well. "This is ridiculous," she said softly. "People are acting like she is some kind of celebrity." Jason laughed, but the sound lacked conviction. "She is not. Yet as soon as the words left his mouth, he remembered something. Nearly 2 years earlier, his company had lost a major acquisition opportunity. A competitor had entered negotiations unexpectedly and secured the deal before anyone saw it coming. The name of the investment group involved had appeared briefly in internal discussions. At the time, Jason paid little attention. He simply assumed powerful investors were operating behind the scenes. Now, for reasons he could not fully explain, that memory returned. Across the ballroom, another guest approached Claire and Alexander. Then another. Conversations formed naturally around their table. No one was invited. No one was encouraged. People simply gravitated there. A retired executive who had spent decades in commercial real estate shook Claire's hand and congratulated her on a recent development project. A financial consultant praised one of her investment decisions. Someone else mentioned a charity initiative that had funded educational programs across several states. With every exchange, pieces of a larger picture emerged. Claire listened politely, never volunteering information. She thanked people. Asked questions. Smiled occasionally. The more restrained she remained, the more impressive her success appeared. Then came the moment that changed everything. Near the center of the ballroom stood a large digital display created for the wedding. Earlier it had shown engagement photos and memories from Jason and Tiffany's relationship. During a scheduled transition between slideshows, the screen briefly shifted to sponsor acknowledgments connected to the venue's annual charitable foundation. Most guests paid little attention. Until a familiar name appeared. Bennett Capital Holdings. The name remained on the screen for only a few seconds. But it was enough. A guest near the front stared at the display and immediately looked toward Claire. Another did the same. Then another. The realization spread quickly. Bennett Capital Holdings was not a small investment firm. It was one of the fastest-growing private investment groups in the country. Business publications estimated its value in the billions. And the name was impossible to ignore. Bennett. Claire Bennett. Jason felt his stomach tighten. He turned toward the screen. Then toward Claire. Then back toward the screen again. For the first time all evening, genuine shock appeared on his face. The woman he believed had been left behind years ago was now connected to a level of success far beyond anything he had imagined. And the most unsettling part was not her wealth. It was the realization that she had accomplished all of it without ever needing him to know. For several long seconds, Jason could do nothing except stare at the screen. The name had already disappeared, replaced by wedding photographs and smiling engagement portraits, but the damage was done. Too many people had seen it. Too many people had connected the pieces. Around the ballroom, guests were no longer whispering about possibilities. They were discussing facts. Bennett Capital Holdings. Claire Bennett. Alexander Hayes. The puzzle was assembling itself. One realization after another spread through the crowd. The woman many had quietly pitied at the beginning of the evening was not merely successful. She was operating in a world most of them would never enter. Jason loosened his tie slightly. The ballroom suddenly felt warmer than before. Across the room, Claire remained exactly the same. No victory speech. No attempt to attract attention. No effort to correct anyone's assumptions. She simply continued her conversation with Alexander while guests gradually discovered the truth on their own. That silence made everything more powerful. The people who had underestimated her were now forced to confront their own conclusions. Then another unexpected moment arrived. Near the front of the ballroom, a senior executive from a national development firm approached Claire's table. Several guests recognized him immediately. His company managed projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He extended his hand respectfully. "Claire, it is good to finally see you again." Claire stood and returned the handshake warmly. "It has been a while." The executive smiled. The Chicago project turned out even better than expected. Several nearby guests exchanged confused looks. Chicago project? The executive continued. The board still talks about that acquisition. Most people thought it was impossible. Claire laughed softly. Most people usually do. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it added another layer to the growing mystery. Jason listened from a distance. Every word felt like a glimpse into a life he had never known existed. He remembered the woman who used to sit beside him at a small kitchen table, balancing household expenses with careful precision. He remembered believing her ambitions were modest. He remembered assuming he understood her potential. Now those memories felt incomplete. Almost embarrassing. Meanwhile, another guest approached Alexander. Their conversation briefly shifted toward business news. One sentence drifted clearly through the surrounding tables. The partnership with Bennett Capital changed the entire market. Several people immediately looked toward Claire again. Partnership. Not employment. Not consulting. Partnership. The distinction mattered. It meant Claire was not connected to powerful people because she knew them. She was one of them. Tiffany's smile had completely disappeared now. She glanced around the ballroom and noticed something Jason had not yet fully accepted. The social gravity of the room had changed. Earlier in the evening, people gathered around the newly engaged couple. Now executives, investors, and influential guests were quietly forming circles around Claire and Alexander. Not because they were seeking attention. Because they were seeking access. Then the final piece arrived. A guest seated near Jason checked a financial publication on his phone and froze. His eyes widened. He turned the screen toward the person beside him. Within moments, both were staring at Claire. The publication listed estimated ownership stakes in several private companies. Bennett Capital Holdings appeared prominently. So did an estimated valuation that reached well into the billions. Jason caught a glimpse of the number. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. Then he saw the source. Reputable. Verified. Publicly discussed by analysts. The truth landed with quiet force. Everything he had spent years building was impressive. But compared to Claire's world, it was barely visible. And standing beneath the warm glow of the ballroom lights, he finally understood something that had escaped him for 5 years. Claire had never lost anything when he left. The only person who had failed to see her value was him. The wedding reception continued, but it no longer felt the same. The music still played. The chandeliers still glowed above the ballroom. Guests still laughed and raised glasses. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed permanently. The assumptions that had defined the evening were gone. In their place stood a reality nobody had expected. Claire noticed it in the way people spoke to her now. In the respect behind their smiles. In the careful attention they gave every word she said. But none of it seemed to affect her. She had not come seeking validation. She had not come to prove a point. And that was precisely why her presence carried so much weight. Near the head table, Jason sat quietly for the first time all evening. The confidence that had once surrounded him like a spotlight had faded into reflection. He watched Claire from across the ballroom as she spoke with guests, thanked members of the hotel staff, and carried herself with the same calm grace she had displayed from the moment she arrived. Nothing about her behavior suggested revenge. Nothing suggested bitterness. If anything, she seemed completely at peace. And somehow that realization hurt more than any argument ever could. He remembered the years they spent together. The small apartment where they first dreamed about the future. The long nights discussing goals. The sacrifices she made without asking for recognition. Back then, he had viewed those qualities as ordinary. Tonight, he finally understood how rare they had been. Across the room, Alexander checked his watch and smiled toward Claire. She nodded slightly. Their evening was coming to an end. The two of them stood from the table together. The movement immediately caught the attention of nearby guests. Several people approached to say goodbye. Others thanked Claire for attending. A few introduced themselves for the first time, eager to create a connection that had not seemed valuable only a few hours earlier. Claire treated everyone with the same kindness. No more. No less. Then she made her way toward the ballroom exit. As she passed the head table, her eyes briefly met Jason's. The noise of the room seemed to disappear. No anger existed in her expression. No resentment. No triumph. Only peace. For a moment, Jason looked as though he wanted to say something. An apology. A question. A memory. Perhaps all three. But no words came. Claire simply offered a polite smile. The kind one might give to someone from a chapter of life that had already ended. Then she continued walking. Alexander opened the ballroom door for her, and together they stepped into the softly lit corridor beyond. The doors closed gently behind them. The reception continued. Conversations resumed. Music filled the room once more. Yet many guests found themselves looking toward the exit long after Claire was gone. Not because of her wealth. Not because of Alexander. Not even because of the shocking discoveries that had unfolded throughout the evening. They remembered her because she never once tried to make anyone feel small. She never demanded attention. She never announced her success. She simply lived it. Outside, the night air felt cool and clean after the warmth of the ballroom. Reflections shimmered across the rain-polished pavement as the waiting sedan pulled forward. Claire paused for a moment and looked toward the city skyline glowing in the distance. 5 years earlier, she had walked away from a broken future carrying nothing but uncertainty. Tonight, she walked forward carrying something far more valuable than success. She carried freedom. The sedan door closed softly behind her. The vehicle disappeared into the night. And somewhere inside the ballroom, Jason finally understood the truth. She did not win him back. She won herself.